Captain Alexander Quinn sat in the dimly lit briefing room aboard the star cruiser Perseverance, the weight of the galaxy pressing on his shoulders. He wasn't supposed to be here. Not after everything that had happened. The scars, the failures, the loss. His heart still carried the weight of the last war, his last command, a defeat so catastrophic it had shattered his confidence and ruined his career. But now, in this sterile room, surrounded by faces he didn't recognize and voices he couldn't trust, the same old call was being made. The call that would drag him back into the fire. The Galactic Council, a coalition of species from every corner of the galaxy, had summoned him to lead their final defense against an unstoppable alien force, the Zernak Horde, an ancient and ruthless species bent on conquering the galaxy. The Perseverance, a warship designed to hold back their brutal might, was humanity's last contribution to the galactic struggle, and its captain, Alexander Quinn, was the man they wanted at the helm. Captain Quinn. The voice of the counselor rang out from the holographic projection, his face betraying no emotion. Your experience with unconventional warfare is unparalleled. We need you to lead the united forces against the Horde. Humanity's fate, and the fate of every species in this coalition, rests in your hands. Quinn's stomach churned. He hadn't asked for this. After his last campaign, where his tactics had failed disastrously, he'd sworn never to command again. And yet here he was, being handed a galaxy-wide responsibility with no warning. His eyes flickered to the map before him, an expanding red tide that represented the Zernak's conquests. The numbers were staggering. The enemy's forces were well-coordinated, relentless, and utterly merciless. The Council has decided. The voice continued. You will have command of a multi-species fleet, led by both human and alien commanders. The other races are eager to see this war ended, but there is resistance to your leadership. It will take time to convince them, but your skill as a tactician is undeniable. Quinn clenched his jaw, resisting the urge to lash out. Resistance, the understatement of the year. He'd been on the receiving end of that resistance before. Alien species that had long looked down on humanity as a lesser force. Many still saw them as wild, unpredictable, unworthy of leadership in this war. The idea of a human commanding their combined fleet was an insult to some, especially to the powerful Draxar, a species with their own well-established military traditions. I don't want it, Quinn said, his voice low but firm. His hands gripped the edge of the table, his nails biting into the metal. I've lost enough already. My record speaks for itself. I'm not the man for this job. The counselor's face softened, but only slightly. It's not a choice, Captain. There's no one else left to turn to. You are our last hope. Humanity's last hope. The silence that followed felt suffocating. Quinn stared at the flickering image of the galaxy map, at the red of the Zernak's encroachment slowly devouring the green, blue, and white lights of the Allied systems. I'm not what you think I am, he whispered, almost to himself. But the words hung in the air, heavy and impossible to take back. I'm not a hero. I'm a soldier who's failed too many times. There was a pause before the counselor's voice responded, colder now, but understanding. Then it's time for you to redeem yourself, Captain. A flash of anger surged within Quinn. Redemption doesn't come at the cost of my people. This is not my fight anymore. But just as quickly, the anger faded. Deep down, Quinn knew this wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight to prove something. To himself, to humanity, and perhaps to the galaxy that had all but written them off. He stood up, suddenly aware of the weight of the uniform on his back, of the burden of command being placed on him once again. With a long, resigned sigh, he finally spoke, his voice a sharp, quiet decision. Fine, I'll do it, but don't expect me to lead them with respect. Not until they earn it. The holographic counselor nodded, an unspoken understanding passing between them. The decision had been made. Quinn didn't know it yet, but this reluctant journey would push him to his limits, testing not only his tactical brilliance but his very humanity. And the war, the one he had been so desperately trying to avoid, had just begun. Captain Quinn stepped off the transport shuttle and onto the command deck of the Perseverance. The ship hummed with the low vibrations of its systems powering up, but the atmosphere felt anything but calm. His boots clicked against the metallic floor as he made his way through the maze of corridors, his mind racing with the weight of the task ahead. He was not just commanding the human fleet. He was now expected to lead a coalition of alien forces, each with their own culture, distrust, and agenda. The first alien commander he encountered was Shantor, a towering member of the Draxar, a race of war-hardened giants known for their brutal, almost ritualistic approach to combat. His deep-set eyes glinted with suspicion as he sized Quinn up, his massive arms folded across his chest. Shantor's reputation preceded him. His species considered humans to be undisciplined, emotional, and unworthy of leadership. Quinn met the Draxar's gaze with an unwavering stare. "You're the one leading the ground forces?" he asked, his tone neutral but pointed. Shantor grunted, his voice a low growl. "I am. And you are the human who thinks he can command us." Before Quinn could respond, a third figure, Miria, an agile and calculating Chlorian, entered the conversation. Her race was known for its intellectual prowess and strategic cunning, though they lacked the sheer physical might of the Draxar. Miria's violet eyes scanned Quinn with barely concealed amusement. "The Council is desperate, Quinn," she said, her words dripping with condescension. "We didn't expect a human to be called upon. But I suppose we'll see what you're made of." Quinn's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, choosing instead to focus on the task ahead. "We're not here to debate who's in charge. We're here to win a war. So if you two are done sizing each other up, we need to start planning." Shantor's expression darkened. "You will not command my troops like your pathetic human soldiers. My warriors follow strength, not words." "I don't need to command your warriors," Quinn replied coldly. "I need your trust, and I can promise you this: if we don't work together, none of us will survive." The silence that followed was thick with tension. Shantor's massive frame shifted, but he held his ground. Finally, he spoke. "You may lead, for now." It was a small victory, but it was a start. Quinn's eyes met Miria's, and she gave him a slight nod. Despite their distrust, both the Draxar and the Chlorian knew what the alternative would be: a galaxy in flames, their species destroyed. Hours later, Quinn stood before the multi-species command room, a swirling collection of faces from races he barely understood. He was surrounded by alien generals and warlords, their sharp eyes watching him as he laid out the first phase of the plan. "We strike fast and hard," Quinn began, his voice commanding attention. "We'll hit their supply lines, disrupt their communications, and cripple their forward bases. This isn't going to be a conventional war. We need speed, we need deception, and most importantly, we need unity." Shantor grunted again, but Quinn held his ground. Miria, ever the tactician, nodded. "I like the idea of disrupting their logistics," she said, "but I'll need full access to your fleet's stealth technology. I can't work without it." "Granted," Quinn said, "but I'll need the Chlorian to handle sabotage and misdirection on the ground. Your people know how to get in and out of enemy territory without being detected." The tension between the factions was palpable, but there was a reluctant understanding that their individual strengths would have to mesh if they were to have a hope of surviving this war. The species who had once viewed humans as a distraction now had no choice but to accept Quinn's leadership, if only out of necessity. Hours later, Quinn sat alone in his quarters, poring over the intelligence reports. The plan was risky, a long shot at best, but it was all they had. He had a long history of betting everything on high-risk strategies. The difference this time was that it wasn't just his people at stake. He had the weight of every species in the coalition on his shoulders. His communicator beeped, interrupting his thoughts. It was Miria. "Captain, I've been analyzing the enemy's movements. They've begun reinforcing a forward base on the edge of their territory. It's vulnerable. If we hit them now, we can weaken their forces and buy ourselves time. Quinn hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Make it happen. We move out within the hour. As he closed the comm, he glanced out the viewport at the stars beyond, knowing this was just the beginning. The real test had yet to come. Would the Alliance hold? Or would the cracks in their unity break them apart before they ever stood a chance? The answer would come soon enough. The Perseverance's engines roared to life, propelling the massive ship through the void toward the target. The alliance of species, still fragile and fraught with tension, was about to face its first major test. Quinn stood at the command deck, observing the holographic projections of the fleet as it readied itself for the strike on the Zernak forward base. The plan was simple: hit hard and fast, disable their supply lines, and make a quick retreat before the Horde could retaliate. But simple plans often had a way of unraveling when egos and distrust were involved. Quinn was acutely aware that this mission wasn't just about winning the battle. It was about proving to his allies that humanity was more than capable of leading a united front. He could sense their eyes on him, the unease rippling through the crew. The Draxer generals, standing tall with their armored forms, were silent, their pride weighing heavily in the air. Myria, the Chlorian tactician, was deep in thought, her sharp mind calculating every potential variable. She was loyal, but her loyalty was born from pragmatic calculation, not respect. He needed something more than that. He needed trust. "Captain," Myria's voice broke through the tension. "We've finished our analysis. There's a hidden Zernak communications hub beneath the base. If we disable it, we can isolate their reinforcements and slow them down long enough for our strike force to hit their supply lines. But it's risky. Their perimeter is heavily guarded." Quinn's eyes narrowed. It was a perfect target. If they could get in and out quickly enough. What's the best way in? Myria glanced at the Draxer commanders, who were standing like statues in the background, eyes fixed on the tactical screens. Stealth infiltration. The Chlorian forces are best suited for this, but we'll need full access to your cloaking tech. Shantor grunted from across the room, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Your people are experts in stealth. We're better suited to a direct assault." Quinn turned toward the Draxer leader, feeling the tension mounting. "This isn't a direct assault, Shantor. If we hit them head-on, they'll be ready for us. We need to keep them off balance. Disrupt their communications, their logistics. This isn't just about brute force. It's about being smarter." Shantor's nostrils flared, but he didn't challenge Quinn's orders. Instead, the massive alien turned to Myria. "If this fails, it will be your people who pay the price for underestimating our strength." Myria didn't flinch. "Understood. We'll be ready." The tension between the Draxar and Chlorian was palpable, and Quinn could see it, feel it, in the room. But there was little time to address their grievances. This mission needed to be executed flawlessly. Failure wasn't an option. Hours later, as the Alliance fleet approached the Zernak base, the uneasy silence between the species was replaced with the hum of preparation. The Perseverance had launched its strike force, a mixture of human, Chlorian, and Draxer soldiers, each assigned to specific roles based on their capabilities. Quinn stood with Myria, watching the visual displays of the base's defenses. "They'll be expecting something," Quinn muttered, his eyes scanning the coordinates. "We need to make sure they don't see us coming." Myria nodded, her mind already working through the possible countermeasures. "We'll use the asteroid field nearby for cover. It will slow us down, but we can use it to mask our approach." "Do it," Quinn ordered. "And don't let the Draxar charge in too soon. I need them to hold back until we've neutralized the communications hub." Myria gave a small, respectful nod, then turned to coordinate the Chlorian forces. As Quinn watched her move, he couldn't help but feel a flicker of something. Hope, maybe. There was a chance, a slim chance, that they could make this work. The hours of tense silence passed as the fleet advanced toward the base. Quinn paced restlessly on the command deck, the anticipation gnawing at him. The minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity. And then a call came. "We've hit the perimeter." Maria's voice crackled through the comms. "We're in position to disable their communication relay. Chlorian units moving in." Quinn's breath hitched. The Chlorian forces had infiltrated the base under the cover of the asteroid field, and now the true test began. He could only hope they had the time and the resources to pull it off before the Zhernek realized they were under attack. On the command deck, Shantor stepped forward, his face grim. "What now, human?" "Now," Quinn said, his voice steady. "We wait." As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the air grew thick, almost suffocating. Quinn's mind raced through every possible outcome, every risk. He couldn't afford to let doubt creep in. Not now. Then a sudden flash lit up the screen, a transmission from Maria. "We've got it," she said, her voice triumphant. "The communications hub is offline. The Zhernek can't call for reinforcements. We've got their supply lines wide open." Quinn's heart surged with relief, but there was no time to celebrate. The alliance had its opening. He turned toward the Draxer generals. "Now, Shantor, it's time to show them what you've got." Shantor's eyes gleamed with a savage fire. "We will crush them." And for the first time, Quinn felt a flicker of real trust between the factions, because the battle was far from over. But they had taken the first step toward unity. Together, they would strike. Together, they had a chance. The war was no longer just a desperate hope. It was a battle they could win. The chaos of battle erupted as the Draxer forces surged forward, roaring their battle cries as they tore through the Zhernek defenses. The Perseverance fleet followed close behind, swarming the enemy base with a coordinated ferocity that was starting to take hold. Quinn stood at the command center, his eyes fixed on the live feeds, tracking the progress of the assault. The communications relay was down, but the Zhernek were no slouches. They retaliated quickly, countering the initial strike with their own reinforcements from deeper within the base. Quinn gritted his teeth as the numbers on the tactical display shifted in real time. "They're pulling back," Quinn said under his breath, watching as Zhernek forces began to retreat deeper into the complex. They were trying to regroup, but their supply lines were compromised. It was the perfect opportunity to press the attack. "Commander Quinn," Maria's voice crackled through the comms, her tone tense. "We've hit the supply depots, but they're regrouping faster than expected. We need more firepower to keep the pressure on." Quinn turned to Shantor, whose warriors were already engaged in vicious close-quarters combat with the Zhernek. The Draxar were a brutal, relentless force, and it showed in the carnage unfolding on the battlefield. "What's your assessment, Shantor?" Quinn asked, his voice sharp. Shantor grunted, his red eyes glinting with the thrill of the battle. "We've broken their front lines, but they have hidden reserves. They'll strike back with everything they have if we don't finish this quickly. The longer we stay here, the more we risk. We need to finish them now, or we'll lose the advantage." Quinn's mind raced. He was watching the Draxar charge deeper into the heart of the base, but the longer they pushed, the further they spread out. This was a crucial moment. He could see the looming danger of overextending their forces. If they weren't careful, the Zhernek could launch a devastating counterattack and trap them in their own success. "We need to pull back," Quinn ordered, his voice commanding. "Regroup and prepare for a final push. Miria, get your forces out of there. I want the Chlorian to disengage and set up a secondary line of defense. We'll consolidate our position and hit them again with everything we've got." Shantor narrowed his eyes, but he didn't argue. His pride burned in his chest, but he understood the strategy. "You risk a counterattack if we pull back," he warned. "I know," Quinn replied, "but we can't afford to take unnecessary losses. We need to control the tempo of this fight. If we press too far and get bogged down, we won't make it out alive." The communications buzzed again, and Quinn listened intently as Miria confirmed the Chlorian's withdrawal. The fleet began to shift its position, pulling back to consolidate its strength. But even as they regrouped, Quinn could feel the eyes of the allied species on him. Some skeptical, others eager. There was no denying it. The fragile unity they had forged was about to be tested again. It would take more than strategy to keep this alliance together. It would take something Quinn wasn't sure he had: trust. As the fleet reoriented and prepared for the next wave, Quinn sat in the command chair, his hands resting on the armrests. His mind raced through every scenario, every possibility. It was clear now. This was not just a war to survive. It was a war to prove humanity's worth to the galaxy. The stakes had been raised, and Quinn knew that if they lost this battle, the consequences would be catastrophic. The alliance might shatter, and the Zernak would have free rein to ravage the galaxy. There was no room for failure. In the aftermath of the initial strike, the fleet held its position, watching the Zernak carefully. The base had been thrown into disarray, but the enemy was not finished yet. Quinn knew it was only a matter of time before they regrouped and retaliated with everything they had. As he stood on the command deck, staring at the tactical map, his thoughts were interrupted by a familiar voice. Shantor stepped up beside him, his massive form looming over the console. "We have them on the ropes," the Draxer said, his voice low and gravelly. "But your plan, will it work?" Quinn met Shantor's gaze, his expression unreadable. "It has to." The tension was palpable. The Draxer general was a warrior, and warriors valued victory, blood and sweat on the battlefield, the kind of victory that came with dominance. But Quinn wasn't interested in dominance. He was interested in survival, in holding on to the fragile alliance long enough to secure a decisive blow. Shantor seemed to sense this, and nodded slightly, his expression hardening with determination. "Then let us finish this." Quinn nodded, feeling the weight of his decision pressing down on him. It wasn't just about defeating the Zernak. It was about proving that a diverse, fractured alliance could stand united. Humanity's survival depended on it. The next phase of the battle would begin shortly. And Quinn knew, deep down, that the real test was about to come, not just of his strategy, but of his ability to keep his fragile alliance intact. With each victory, the pressure mounted. There was no turning back now. The war had only just begun, and Quinn could feel the heavy price of victory looming ahead. The fleet waited in eerie silence, the only sound the hum of the Perseverance's engines. Quinn stood at the command center, his eyes focused on the tactical map, watching as the Zernak forces began to regroup. Their retreat had been chaotic, but now they were reorganizing, preparing for their counteroffensive. Quinn's mind churned as he thought about the next move. "Miria," Quinn said, his voice steady. "What's the status on the Chlorian forces?" "We've managed to extract most of our troops," Miria replied, her voice crackling through the comms. "But we've taken heavy casualties. Some of our operatives are still behind enemy lines, trying to disable secondary defenses." Quinn felt a pang of guilt. The Chlorian had followed his orders without hesitation, but at what cost? They had lost far more than expected in the initial strike. If the Zernak had regrouped faster than anticipated, it was likely that the Chlorian forces would be caught in the crossfire. "You did what you had to," Quinn muttered. "Just get them out of there. We'll hit them again soon." But even as he spoke the words, Quinn knew that it wouldn't be enough. The situation was rapidly spiraling out of control. Shantor, ever the warlord, strode up to Quinn with an expression of grim determination. "The Zernak will hit us hard. We've seen their tactics before. They will be relentless. If we want to finish them off, we need to press now, before they can regroup fully." Quinn met Shantor's gaze, feeling the weight of the decision. "We can't just charge in. We need to know where their reinforcements are coming from. Otherwise, we risk walking into a trap." "Then we strike now," Shantor growled. "I'm not waiting for another hour while they get stronger. Our warriors will overwhelm them." Quinn's eyes flickered to the map again, and for a moment he considered Shantor's words. The Draxar were fierce, but impulsive. Charging in without proper intelligence would put the entire fleet at risk. The last thing they needed was a reckless assault that could cost them everything. "I'm not risking everything on a gut feeling," Quinn said sharply. "We'll wait. We'll use the time to gather more intel and track their movements. Once we have the upper hand, we'll strike, together." Shantor's eyes narrowed, but he didn't argue. Instead, he stepped back, his posture stiff and displeased. The Draxar respected strength, and while Quinn's decisions had kept them alive so far, there was no mistaking the simmering resentment in the air. Quinn could feel it. The cracks were beginning to show. This alliance was fragile at best, and it wasn't just the Zhernak that threatened to break them. It was the mistrust between them. Hours passed, each one stretching longer than the last. Quinn kept the fleet in position, waiting for the moment when they could strike decisively. But as the time ticked by, the tension between the species began to boil over. The Draxar generals were restless, pacing on their ships and communicating in low, harsh tones. Even Miria's usual calm seemed to falter, her sharp eyes constantly scanning the horizon, as though searching for a reason to push the attack. Finally, the silence was broken by a comm alert. Quinn's heart skipped a beat as the familiar voice of Miria crackled over the comms. "Captain, we've got trouble. Zhernak reinforcements have arrived. They're coming in heavy, more than we anticipated." Quinn's hand tightened around the edge of his console. "How many?" "Too many," Miria said bluntly. "They're moving toward our position. We can't delay any longer. They'll hit us hard if we don't act." Quinn ran a hand over his face, his mind racing. He had no choice now. They had to act before the Zhernak gained full control of the battlefield. "Shantor," Quinn barked, "you have permission to move out. Coordinate with Miria, and prepare for a counterassault." Shantor's eyes flashed with approval, but there was something darker beneath the surface. "It's about time." As the Draxar and Chlorian forces began to move out, Quinn remained on the command deck, watching the unfolding chaos. The fleet launched into action, tearing through the enemy lines with a coordinated force that shook the Zhernak to their core. But even as the battle raged on, Quinn could see the growing dissonance between the species. The Draxar pressed forward with a savage, almost reckless abandon, while the Chlorian moved with calculated precision, staying focused on their assigned targets. The alliance had been pushed to its limits. "Captain, the Zhernak are regrouping on our left flank," Miria reported, her voice tense. "We need reinforcements now." Quinn clenched his fists, trying to ignore the rising panic. They were fighting tooth and nail to hold their position, but the cracks in their unity were beginning to widen. He could feel it, his authority slipping, the uneasy bond between the species fracturing under the weight of the battle. "Hold the line," Quinn shouted, his voice fierce with the urgency of the situation. But inside, he knew the truth. The longer this battle went on, the more fragile their alliance became. The Zhernak were relentless, and so were his allies. But would they hold together long enough to win? Or would the unity they had so desperately fought for collapse in the face of overwhelming adversity? As the battle raged around him, Quinn's thoughts were interrupted by an explosion that shook the Perseverance. The enemy was closing in, and Quinn knew that every decision from here on out would shape not just the outcome of the war, but the very future of the fragile alliance he had worked so hard to forge. The battle raged on, but Quinn could feel the tide beginning to shift. Every second that passed, the fractures within the alliance grew more apparent. His tactical choices, though sound, weren't enough to keep the tenuous balance intact. Shantor's Draxar were becoming more impatient with every order to hold back, while the Chlorian, though disciplined, were beginning to question whether their sacrifices were being made in vain. As the explosions and gunfire echoed across the battlefield, Quinn stood on the command deck, staring at the tactical displays. The Zhernak were pushing hard on their right flank, trying to encircle the fleet. He had no illusions about the challenge they faced now. This was no longer a war just against the Zhernak. It was a war for the survival of the Alliance itself. "Captain," Muria's voice broke through his thoughts, urgent and tense. "The Draxar are moving too far ahead. We need to pull them back before they overextend. They're not waiting for your orders." Quinn's gaze flickered to the feed of the Draxar battle lines, his heart sinking. The Draxar were charging forward with reckless abandon, tearing through the Zhernak forces, but they were leaving their flanks vulnerable. It was a classic Draxar move. Take the fight head-on, crush anything in their path, and risk losing control of the battlefield in the process. Quinn's fingers hovered over the command console, unsure whether to send the order to rein them in or let them push ahead and take the advantage. Either choice could have catastrophic consequences. "Shantor," Quinn muttered, tapping his comms. "Pull back your forces. Regroup. Now." There was a long pause before the harsh growl of Shantor's voice came through. "We do not retreat, human. You've asked us to fight, and we fight. We will break their will. Stay out of our way." The audacity in Shantor's tone was clear. The Draxar weren't just fighting to win. They were fighting for pride. Quinn's teeth clenched, and for a moment, the weight of the situation threatened to crush him. If he pushed the Draxar too hard, they might rebel entirely. If he let them act with impunity, the entire alliance could collapse under the pressure. "Damn it," Quinn muttered. He was caught between the unyielding Draxar pride and the calculated precision of the Chlorian. Either faction could break the alliance if he wasn't careful. "Miria," Quinn barked, his mind working rapidly. "Get your forces in position. If Shantor doesn't pull back, we'll need to move in with everything we've got to shield his flank." "I'm on it," Miria replied, and Quinn could hear the grit in her voice. She knew as well as he did that the Chlorian couldn't afford to risk an all-out confrontation with the Draxar. The situation was delicate. As Quinn issued the orders, his mind raced through their options. The Zhernak were regrouping, and they wouldn't wait much longer to press their advantage. If the Draxar didn't listen, they would be surrounded, and the entire alliance could be crushed in a matter of hours. Quinn needed to act fast. The moments stretched into agonizing minutes. Quinn watched the battlefield, seeing how the Draxar were engaged in fierce combat. But now they were becoming too scattered, too vulnerable. His heart raced as the Zhernak began to close in on their position. Quinn cursed under his breath. Time was running out. Then his comms crackled again, but this time it wasn't Miria. It was Shantor, his voice cold and challenging. "You've made a grave mistake, human," Shantor said. "You have no right to command me. I lead my warriors." "Shantor," Quinn growled, trying to keep his cool. "This is about survival. If you don't pull back, we'll be surrounded. The Zhernak will wipe us all out." The Draxar general's response was a low guttural laugh. "I am not afraid of death, and you should not be either. It is the way of the Draxar. You are a human, and you do not understand our ways." Quinn's blood ran cold. The Draxar weren't just fighting for victory. They were fighting for honor, and they were willing to risk everything for it. But the cost of that honor could be the downfall of everything they had worked for. "Pull back now." Quinn's voice was sharp with authority, but even he could hear the desperation in it. "Or we all die." A long pause followed, and for a moment, Quinn thought the worst, that the Draxar would continue their reckless charge, sealing their fate. But then, surprisingly, Shantor spoke again, his tone slightly calmer, though still tinged with defiance. "We will give you one chance," Shantor said. "But if you fail, we fight our way through to the end." The line went dead. Quinn let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Shantor had agreed to pull back, at least for now. But Quinn knew that the situation had shifted irreparably. The Draxar had taken a huge risk, and their pride had been bruised. The Chlorian were watching closely, and Quinn could feel the tension rising. The battle wasn't over yet, but something fundamental had changed. The Draxar were no longer just allies. They were potential enemies. And in the chaos of war, that could make all the difference. As the Draxar began to reposition, Quinn turned back to the map, his mind already calculating their next move. The Zernak were still a serious threat, but the cracks within the alliance were widening. Trust was the only thing holding them together, and Quinn wasn't sure how much longer even that would last. The fragile unity of their alliance was breaking, and Quinn knew that the real war was only just beginning. The tension in the command center was palpable. Quinn could feel it gnawing at him, the weight of every decision growing heavier with each passing moment. The Draxar had pulled back, begrudgingly, but it was clear that their pride had been wounded. Xantor had given him one last chance, but Quinn knew that this fragile truce wouldn't hold for long. The Draxar needed to win, and they needed to win now. They weren't interested in survival. They were interested in glory. The Zernak were regrouping, and Quinn couldn't afford to waste another moment. They were still the more organized force, despite the chaos of the last few hours. If they consolidated, their advantage would be too great for the Allied fleet to overcome. "Miria," Quinn said, his voice firm but tired. "Status update. What's our position? We've held the left flank for now, but the Zernak are regrouping with more firepower than we anticipated. They've got fresh reinforcements from the core world, and they're bringing in advanced artillery. We can't afford another direct confrontation," Miria reported, her voice strained. "We need to hold them off while we regroup, or we risk losing the entire sector." Quinn cursed under his breath. The Zernak were pulling out all the stops, and with each new wave of reinforcements, their chances of victory were shrinking. The Alliance couldn't afford a drawn-out battle. It had to be decisive. And with the fragile relationships between the species, it had to come now. "Xantor," Quinn said, his voice low and measured. "We need to hit them with everything we've got. This is our last chance." There was no immediate response. Quinn glanced over at the tactical display. The Draxar were still holding their positions, but the tension in their movements was evident. They were waiting for something. They were waiting for Quinn to make the call, but he knew that they wouldn't follow his lead forever. If they didn't strike soon, the Draxar might abandon the alliance entirely. Quinn knew he had to push them, but with caution. A full-on assault now could break the fragile alliance and push the Draxar into a full rebellion. On the other hand, if they didn't act soon, they would all be dead. "Miria," Quinn said again, his tone resolute, "I want the Chlorian forces to begin targeting the Zernak's artillery placements. We'll break their lines before they can mobilize fully." "Acknowledged," Miria replied. "But we need the Draxar to keep the pressure on the Zernak's main force. I'll need their support to make this work." Quinn nodded, but he knew the real challenge was getting Xantor to agree. If the Draxar didn't follow his orders, the entire plan could fall apart. He turned back to the comms, his voice unwavering despite the uncertainty that churned in his gut. "Xantor," Quinn said, "we need your warriors to strike now. If you hit their main forts hard, we'll have a chance to break their artillery positions. But we need your strength." The response came swiftly, and this time, there was no hesitation in Xantor's voice. "This is our moment, human. But mark my words, if we are to succeed, it will not be because of your fragile alliances. It will be because of the Draxar's fury." Quinn's jaw tightened. He could hear the challenge in Xantor's voice, but he couldn't afford to let it get under his skin. If the Draxar moved now, they would break through the Zernak's front lines, and the Chlorian could target their artillery. It could be the game changer they needed. "Do it," Quinn said, his voice resolute. The Perseverance fleet surged forward, the Draxar leading the charge with brutal efficiency. Quinn watched as Xantor's forces tore through the Zernak's front line, their ferocity unmatched. The Chlorian followed closely behind, moving with calculated precision to neutralize the Zernak artillery positions. For a moment, it seemed as though the battle might be won, but then the Zernak revealed their hidden ace. From beneath the surface of the enemy base, massive war machines, heavily armored walkers, emerged, opening fire on the advancing forces. "Muria," Quinn barked. "We need anti-armor support now." The Chlorians scrambled to engage, but the walkers were formidable, far stronger than anything they had anticipated. The Draxard were tearing through the Zernak infantry, but the walkers were holding their ground, pushing back the front lines. "Shantor," Quinn shouted through the comms. "You have to flank them. Get around the walkers. We can't break their lines unless we take out their support." There was a tense pause before Shantor responded. "We fight to the death, Quinn. We do not flank. We break their will directly." "Damn it, Shantor," Quinn shouted, his patience fraying. "You're risking everything. We'll lose everything if you don't follow orders." But Shantor's response was cold, unwavering. "Then it will be the price of victory." Quinn's mind raced, and in that moment, he realized just how fragile this entire mission had become. The Draxart were so entrenched in their pride that they couldn't see the bigger picture. It was no longer just a battle against the Zernak. It was a battle for control, for leadership, and for the future of the Alliance. Quinn knew that if they were going to win, it couldn't just be through brute force. It would take more than that. He had to act, quickly. He made a decision that might break him, might break them all. "Muria," Quinn said, his voice shaking with the weight of his next words. "We go after the walkers. Pull the Chlorian back. I'll lead the assault with the fleet." There was no turning back now. He was betting everything on one final strike. A strike that could shatter the Alliance for good, or bring them a victory they could never have imagined. The fleet surged forward again, and this time, there was no hesitation. It was make or break. Quinn's heart pounded as the Perseverance and the remaining ships in their fleet surged forward toward the Zernak's heavily armored walkers. His decision to lead the assault was one born of desperation. The Draxar had made their choice, and if they wouldn't follow his command, Quinn would have to make the hard call himself. But with the Chlorian now pulling back to cover the flanks, and the Draxar still pressing forward without considering the bigger picture, Quinn was gambling everything on this final push. "Captain, we've got the walkers in sight." Muria's voice cut through the tense atmosphere of the command deck. "They're heavily shielded, and their weapons are far more advanced than anything we anticipated. If we don't disable them soon, we'll lose our entire fleet." Quinn's mind raced. The walkers were formidable, designed to resist nearly every form of attack. The best option now was to focus on their weak points, underneath, where the plating was thinner, where the power cores were exposed. It was a narrow chance, but it was the only one left. "Focus all fire on the underside of the walkers," Quinn ordered, his voice sharp. "Take out their legs and power cores. Muria, coordinate with the Chlorian forces. They'll need to provide covering fire while we move in." "Acknowledged," Muria replied, her voice grim but determined. "We've got your back, Captain. Just don't make it impossible for us." The ships of the fleet powered forward, weapons blazing, as they opened fire on the walkers' legs. Quinn gritted his teeth as explosions rang out across the battlefield. The first walker took a hit, its knee joints collapsing under the barrage of fire. But it didn't fall. The sheer size of the machines made them more resilient than Quinn had hoped. "Damn," Quinn muttered, watching the walkers' adaptive shields flicker and regenerate as his fleet's firepower washed over them. "We need more firepower. All ships, focus on disabling their movement. If we can't stop them from advancing, it's game over." But just as Quinn thought they might be gaining ground, the Zernak retaliated with a barrage of their own. The walkers' weapons were devastating. One of the smaller Chlorian ships was caught in the blast, its hull crumpling as the Zernak artillery tore through it. The remnants of the ship burned in the atmosphere, a stark reminder of just how high the stakes were. "Muria," Quinn shouted over the comms, "we need that Chlorian squadron to fall back and regroup. They're too exposed." "I'm pulling them back," Miria responded, though her voice was tight with strain. But their losses are mounting. We don't have much time. Quinn's eyes darted over the tactical map as more and more reinforcements poured in from the Zhernak rear lines. The Draxar were pushing deeper into the enemy's ranks, but they were scattered, disorganized, too focused on their glory to care about the bigger picture. Quinn knew that if the walkers didn't fall soon, everything they had worked for would unravel. Then, as if answering his desperate thoughts, the unthinkable happened. Xantor's voice came over the comms, heavy with fury, but also with a begrudging respect. "We are with you, Quinn," the Draxar warlord growled. "It is time to finish this." Quinn's breath caught in his chest. He hadn't expected the Draxar to support the plan, but the realization that they were finally willing to cooperate gave him a sliver of hope. The Draxar surged forward again, their warriors charging headlong into the Zhernak lines, smashing into them with the ferocity only they could bring. In that moment, the balance shifted. With the Draxar finally coordinating their assault, the Chlorian took the opportunity to target the walkers' exposed power cores, hitting them with precision fire that started to crack their shields. Quinn's ships, following suit, moved in closer, pummeling the walker's underbelly with concentrated fire. And then, with a deafening roar, the first walker exploded, its legs buckling as its power core detonated in a ball of fire. The shockwave sent ripples through the battlefield, shaking the very air. Quinn's eyes widened. That was the break they needed. "Keep going," Quinn barked. "We can do this. Push them back. Hit the next one." With the fall of the first walker, the Zhernak began to lose their composure. Their advanced artillery was still deadly, but the destruction of their heavy infantry had shifted the tide. The remaining walkers began to stagger, unable to keep up with the relentless barrage from all sides. The Draxar were on the move again, a blur of savage warriors slicing through the Zhernak lines, while the Chlorian capitalized on their opening, picking off the remaining artillery units. Quinn watched as his fleet closed in on the last walker. He could feel the blood pumping in his ears, the adrenaline of the final push surging through his veins. The Zhernak were reeling. Their once formidable position was now collapsing, and as the last walker went up in a fiery explosion, Quinn allowed himself a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. But the battle wasn't over. The Zhernak, though retreating, were still dangerous. The Alliance had won a critical victory, but the cost had been staggering. The Chlorian were near their breaking point, and Xantor's forces were battle-worn, their pride bruised. Quinn knew that the true fight for survival wasn't over. It had only just begun. "Miria," Quinn said, his voice low but resolute. "What's the status?" "We've won this battle," Miria replied, a touch of relief creeping into her voice. "But the war isn't over, and we still have a lot of rebuilding to do." Quinn stood tall, looking out at the battlefield as the last remnants of the Zhernak forces retreated. The Alliance had survived, but only by the narrowest of margins. They had fought with everything they had, but the real challenge lay ahead. Could they stay united long enough to win the war? For now, though, Quinn allowed himself a brief moment of victory. The reluctant commander had led his forces to a hard-earned triumph, but in the back of his mind, the true battle, one for unity and survival, still loomed large.